What's going on YouTube? Cloverless here, back with another Scarlet Violet video, and today we're going to be starting up, or should I say restarting, our Regulation H content on the channel. Yes, that's right. So remember, I put out a community post a couple days ago, and I did mention that for the month of August, I'm going to mixing up our Regulation I, J, and H content, something that I've never done before, or I don't think anyone has done, because again, we're in this weird transitional period where this is the last month of Regulation I, and then next month, starting in September, Regulation J starts, where you get to use mythicals along with your two restricted requirement, of course. But in-person VGC events will be going by Regulation H. Okay, so that's the weird thing. Rank Ladder will feature Regulation J, but in-person events will be Regulation H. Oh my goodness. All right. So because of that, we're going to be, again, starting up this content, and we're going to help prepare you for your in-person events. And the difference this time, as opposed to last time, is we have 4 months of data to look back on and just simply pick up where we left off. And today we're going to be talking about the 10 best archetypes that you can use. Technically, there's 11 here on my screen, but one of them I can kind of consider as one, and you'll see what I mean by when I talk about that, right? But these were the best ideas to use in Regulation H. Now, these are not the only ideas, because technically in Regulation H, it was a lawless land, as I like to say in some of those videos, because a lot of things were viable and a lot of things could come out to play, because stuff like, you know, Calyrexes and Miraidons, there's no broken Astral Barrage, no broken Glacial Lance, no broken Electro Drift. Things could actually be viable and played because there wasn't so much of a power creep, right? And that's good in terms of, you know, viability and variance. And you get to play your fun favorite mon again, right? That was a non-legendary, okay? And we'll talk about those ideas because, again, a lot of things were very much playable. And if you look back on our channel in Regulation H, I was featuring a spotlight mon here and there almost every other day, because things were fun back then. I you know, not that they weren't fun now, but we got to play some pretty cool mons that normally just don't get to come out and do what they want to do, because you have a Calyrex clicking Astral Barrage and it just invalidates some of your fun favorite mons, right? Yes, I totally get it. I totally understand it. Okay, but anyway, we're gonna go over some of these archetypes. We're gonna talk about how they're structured, how they work. We'll talk about the supporting pieces, because again, a lot of this stuff you might face the mirror, but some of the pieces might be different depending on how you want to play the squad. And that is always the case anytime you talk about archetypes in BGC. The core of the team won't change. It's some of the pieces around it that will make all the difference here. All right, so let's go ahead and let's start from the bottom. All right, so anytime we're talking about Regulation H, I feel like we got to start here with our first archetype, and that is Archaludon Rain, with, of course, the rain coming from little old Pelipper, not a Kyogre. So again, like we said, no big restricteds, no broken damage coming around here. Zamazenta is now, of course, your primary body press user, but Archaludon was the main guy clicking that move in a format where there was no Zamazenta, right? That's because of stamina here. So anytime you're taking physical damage, or actually just damage in general, when you get hit, you're going to rack up your defense, and that means you're going to deal harder hitting body presses, right? Now, of course, it's non-stab, but that's okay. With this defense and all that boost that you're getting with stamina, it's going to hit very, very hard, right? And then, of course, it combos well with Pelipper, because in the rain, your Electro Shot doesn't need any charge time, and you get a special attack boost, so this could also ramp up in damage. And then you have your typical stab moves of Flash Cannon and Draco Meteor, right? So as a starting point, you know, with any rain team, you're going to want like a strong steel type, and you want a pretty good grass type. And usually this is always something like an Amoonguss. Okay, and this gave you a Trick Room matchup here, and Amoonguss was really, really good because, again, you had healing potential with Pollen Puff here, you had Spore Pressure, you had redirection support with Rage Powder. It was a very, very good mod, and it's always a good mod. Doesn't matter the format, Amoonguss is always going to be a good mod, right? Incineroar as a fire type was also pretty good on these types of teams, or again, because with Fake Out Pressure and repositioning, Incineroar is just really, really good. Now, it wasn't, in my opinion, Incineroar wasn't as good in Reg H as opposed to a restricted format because of the power creep difference, but Incineroar was still amazing in any kind of VGC format, if you will, right? And this gives you a nice little Fire, Water, Grass core with Instant, Pelipper, and Amoonguss. And this allows you to position the board because you had access to either U-Turn if you had an AV or Parting Shot if you were just a standard Incineroar set here. And usually this Steel type was more often than not a Gholdengo. Again, another strong special attacker that could thrive under Tailwind and also help get the setup needed with Fake Out and or Redirection, right? Because you were going for Nasty Plot here. So this was your main Nasty Plot user, not the Calyrex Shadow Rider. And your broken spread move was Make It Rain, not Astro Barrage, of course. So Gholdengo gets to come back and play in this format. Gholdengo was amazing, right? Because again, good as gold, that gave you some immunity to an opposing Amoonguss, right? And then from here, usually you had a cleaner, no Urshifu, right? So in the rain, our main cleaner was a Basculegion. So in the late game scenario, you could bring this in and, of course, start clicking Last Respects. You had pressure with Wave Crash. Swift Swim gave you the speed control even without the Tailwind. Okay, you had priority Aqua Jet. And this was basically the Urshifu that is not even an Urshifu, right? I just want to say it, okay? But again, look at this rain team. This rain team was one of the first rain teams created back in September, and it was still one of the best teams even until the end of the format in Regulation H in December, right? That's how good this team was. People were still using this 6 as a core, even up until when it ended. And that you're going to see this again if you haven't seen it so already on the Limitless tournaments, because it's just so balanced in how it functions. You've got Intimidate, you've got Fake Out Pressure, you've got Status, you have damage mitigation, you have speed control here, okay? And you have pretty good synergy with some of these mons, right? Again, Archaludon being weak to the fighting type moves like a close combat from a Sneasler, which is how Sneasler came to be. You needed a way to answer Archaludon, and that was the main thing, because in the beginning of Regulation H, there wasn't really much Sneasler going around. Sneasler came out a little bit later. That's because they needed to answer the Archaludon. And then what you can do is actually pivot out the Archaludon into Basculegion, which is a ghost type. So this way the fighting move gets whiffed, right? And then of course you can always pivot in and out your Pelipper. So this way you could either give your Archaludon a Electro Shot without charge, or you could boost the speed for your Basculegion, okay? Because of Swift Swim here, right? So, and then sometimes even Gholdengo was your late game cleaner with Make It Rain there. So you had the physical damage presence with Basculegion, and you had the defensive backbone with Incineroar and Amoonguss, and then you had the special attack damage coming out from Archaludon and Gholdengo potentially here. So this was always one of the main teams, but this wasn't the only way to play Pelipper and Archaludon, right? There were some other variations that you could do that came out later on, and those variations featured something like this: Ursaluna and Sinistcha here, right? So instead of the Amoonguss, you're going to get Sinistcha. Why? Because again, now you can give yourself a Trick Room mode to the team. And Arc is relatively slow, and Ursaluna is even slower. And then you could use this to enable the Ursaluna as well, because again, you can give yourself Trick Room. And Ursaluna also has pretty good synergy with some of these mons, especially, with Pelipper here. You can click Earthquake next to it if you have to. And then, of course, you can click Broken Facade in Trick Room if you have to, right? And then after this, sometimes you still needed that flying type here. Usually you had Dragonite come onto these teams. And then we'll start talking about the double dragon archetype a little bit later. But this was another way to play it, if you really wanted to also vary up your differences with Arc Rain. Other ways to play it, and we'll talk about this after we look at our next archetype. You could also play this with Maushold and Annihilape, okay? And we'll speak more about this when we get to that part. But these two in itself was an archetype alone, but people figured out that you can combine both of these two. All right, and now this can become the core of your squad. And we'll show you some of the pieces that you could use to round out the last couple of slots there. But in essence, Arc Rain is going to be one of the more popular archetypes just because of how much it can deal in terms of raw damage. And then you have all that speed control. And like I said, all that support with some of those partners. So it's no reason why you can't do this. All right, and then eventually people also started to feature a Psyspam element where they started to bring out Male Indeedee and another Sneasler to come here, where now you had this, because again, you got Tailwind coming from Pelipper, you also had the Trick Room aspect coming from the Male Indeedee, and then you also had Expanding Force, okay, and then the Sneasler thrived under this because you had the Psychic Seeds to boost up your Unburden, and then from here you just click Broken Dire Claw broken close combat and whatnot, and etc, etc. This was another way to play it if you really wanted to experiment this way. All right, now some of these other teams also featured a Salamence idea. Salamence Rain was also pretty common back then. You still had this like Amoonguss, and then you even had King Gambit as another steel type besides Gholdengo, because again, Gambit in the Rain was a very, very useful idea. As steel types in general was always very useful, because as a steel type, you take less damage from fire type attacks in the Rain. This was also a pretty good check into a lot of the Psyspam stuff that was more prevalent in Regulation H than it is now. So you had the immunity to that, and you could deal super effective damage into some of those Psyspam cores. Okay, and of course, you know, just you were weak to Sneasler, but you still had ways to deal around it. And then this last slot, it could have been just something like an Incineroar for that matter, but it was an easy slot to round out there, right? But anyway, we'll talk more about some of the other supporting pieces as we do more team building around Archaludon Rain when we'll start that up again. But I just wanted to give you some ideas as far as like what to start out with if you wanted to play this archetype. Remember this fearsome duo, the return of Maushold and Annihilape, also known as Mouseape here. So Annihilape, very threatening Pokemon in this type of format. With Defiant, you get to Discourage, Incineroar Intimidates, immediately get a boost if they do lead it. And then they ran a setup set with Bulk Up, okay, which is important because again, you're boosting your attack and your defenses. And now you partnered this with Maushold, which has Friend Guard, so now all of a sudden you're taking even less damage. And then, of course, you get to go for stuff like Beat Up, which, again, doesn't do much damage into Annihilape at all. But what it does do is it starts to ramp up your damage for Rage Fist. And then you just start one-shotting things left and right here. And then with a couple of Bulk Ups, you know, this is going to do even more damage. Your Drain Punch is going to keep you alive because, again, you're getting so much recovery with these harder-hitting Drain Punch after the setup with Bulk Up. And overall, it's just a very interesting and menacing duo to deal with because sometimes you have to get a couple of 50-50s, right? Sometimes they may just protect the Maushold and then they just go for the free Bulk Up, right? Or they may pivot in and out. They may go for the Terragosi if you go for the fighting move into the Maushold. So sometimes you have to make some reads, but because of that, that's what makes this archetype hard to play. So the most success Maushold and Annihilape did have was actually with the archetype we just talked about, Archaludon Rain. And we'll, you know, mention those ideas and those pairings when we talk about the two of them together. But if you wanted to just play these two without the Archaludon Rain, a very easy core that you could do is just some Tailwind user, you know, for example, a Talonflame with some aggressive offense or in terms of special attack. And usually that was always a Gholdengo here. And then after this, Hydreigon was often a common partner. Hydreigon gets to come out and play, right? Forget about this Iron Jugulus nonsense. Okay, or the Roaring Moon stuff, you get Hydreigon access again. Okay, and Hydreigon was a pretty decent mon here. You had stuff like Focus Energy sets, or you could even do the Choice Specs AV sets where you can go for big damage with the Draco Meteors, or you can, you know, go for a little bit more of a damage mitigation idea with Snarl with the Hydreigon. Either way, you got to play Hydreigon in this format. Right, and then usually this is something like a Rillaboom, you know, just to round out your kind of team here. At least give yourself some fake out pressure, right? And then this way you could set up said Nasty Plot or set up said Bulk Up if you have to, and then get more recovery for your Annihilape, right? So now you're combining leftovers for grassy terrain recovery, and now that's just going to help Annihilape get more health back, and then that means it gets to stay on the field longer and keep dealing more chip damage, and then set up your Gholdengo endgame potentially, right? So I believe this team was something done by, I think it was James Beck, right? I remember he did bring something like this or something very similar. But again, Mouseape, you know, can be slapped on to a lot of different cores. I've even seen Mouseape slapped on to Dondozo and Tatsugiri. So that's another way that you can play this if you really want to play that kind of direction. Where are you, Tatsugiri? But more on this when we actually speak about Dondozo Tatsugiri in a bit. But again, you just have to really get some of these plays right. Like you could even do stuff like Dragonite here. Okay, I've even seen D-Knight come onto these teams with a Gholdengo again, right? And the Dragonite sometimes would even just provide Tailwind support with Scale Shot, right? But more on that a little bit later. But this is another cord that you can definitely utilize, and then Rillaboom can still come back here just to give you that fake out support. And combined with redirection, this is what you're doing. You're enabling both the Annihilape and the Gholdengo on some of these teams, right? You could play this a little bit more hyper offense, where you could lead something like a Talonflame yet again, okay? And then this time go for a little bit more hyper offense, where you have, what's that thing called? The Delphi. Actually, it wasn't even like Talonflame. It was something. Oh, it was Murkrow, right? Yeah, it was Murkrow. You got to play Murkrow in this format, guys. That's how good Regulation H was. You got to use some of these other prankster Pokemon that normally just wouldn't get any screen time. And then from here, you could just add the Sneasler, right? This was a thing. And then the Psychic Terrain ideas, you know, with something like an Indeedee. This was another kind of card that you could play. And I remember this from the regional. I don't remember who played this team, but this was another way, right? Where you get just play like, you know, Tailwind, Heat Wave. You know, you gave yourself Terrain, another redirector to help set up the Annihilape. Sneasler got to thrive here with the Psychic Seeds. Okay, this is another way that you could play it if you wanted to. Okay, but most of the success came with the Archaludon Rain here. I think there was one other way that you could play this just to show you like a little bit of variance. Just another 4-person course. So again, how about this one? Talonflame and Garchomp, right? Remember this? Like Talonflame Garchomp was like back in Regulation A, but it was still good even right now, even in this format too. And then from here, like I said, you could still put in a Gholdengo, okay, and then round it out here with something like Primarina, for example. Right, this is another archetype you could play as well, and it still did relatively well because again, you have a lot of aggressive offense. You have some setup here. You have support to enable some of these mons, especially like Garchomp, Gholdengo, Talonflame was a very, very strong card that you could utilize. But again, the secret with Maushold was that you could literally put this onto a 4 Pokemon core and it was okay because those two as a standalone was fine. All right, now how about if you play Arc Rain together with Maushold Annihilape? You can do this. It actually works out relatively well because again, you got a nice good ghost type here onto your team that you could use as a fighting pivot for your Archaludon here. Maushold is great with both of these, right? Because again, with Beat Up and Friend Guard, Beat Up into Archaludon now all of a sudden boosts up your stamina boost, your defense boost, and now you're just going for these insanely hard-hitting body presses. Okay, and then of course Pelipper just providing rain support for Archaludon along with the Tailwind idea, just to have yourself some more speed control. It just made this relatively annoying. And then now I recall Fevzi's team from Dortmund, and now you add something like a Sinistcha here, and both Annihilape and Archaludon love this Pokemon, right? Because again, with Hospitality, you can get more healing back for your Annihilape, right? What you can even do is just pivot out your Maushold, protect the Annihilape, pivot in the Sinistcha, you know, get recovery for your Annihilape, and then after that, redirect and set a bulk up again. And then just keep pivoting your Sinistcha in and out, keep getting your Annihilape more recovery, and it just doesn't die because now after a couple of bulk up boosts, now this Annihilape is just going to sweep you, especially with the Drain Punches and the Rage Fist. So the healing and the pivoting with Sinistcha and Maushold together is just insane, okay? And then same thing with Archaludon. You know, you're getting all this, you're taking damage, you're getting all this defense boost, right? Now you heal the damage back with Sinistcha, and now all of a sudden, Archaludon becomes hard to remove. And you get to redirect the fighting move against it because Sinistcha has Rage Fighter. This is one of my favorite teams, honestly. And then to make it worse, Fevzi and his squad, they added Grimmsnarl to this, and now you're adding bulk to the entire team, and now all of a sudden you can't damage anything because now you're just hiding behind the screens. Okay, you've already got redirection and healing. All of a sudden, Annihilape and Archaludon have everything that they need with this kind of 6. All right, so you know, be aware because you will see this 6, and it's out there. It's not like it's private; it's public. Okay, other ways that you can play this. You can still utilize the Basculegion sweeping engine, you know, with Arc, Pelipper, Basculegion, and whatnot, and still add the Sinistcha here. Okay, I feel like this is a lot of ghost types, so you know, be aware, but still it works just because again, this is your physical late game cleaner. This is your Trick Room setter and healing for your Annihilape and Archaludon, and basically you're just taking this Rain Core and adding the Sinistcha support with Annihilape and Maushold, and it also works relatively well. So you can play it like this if you really want to. Otherwise, you know, there's some other ideas. I remember All Kyle doing something very, very cool where he still used these guys, right? Maushold, Annihilape, Archaludon, Pelipper. And then he added the Hydreigon onto this. All right, where's the Hydreigon here? Yeah, here's the Hydreigon. So now you had Hydreigon, Sinistcha, Pelipper, Archaludon, Maushold Annihilape, and this was another way that you could play. Because again, with Arc and Hydreigon being weak to fighting type attacks, you have a couple of ghost types here that you could come in and pivot. And this Hydreigon set was the Scope Lens Focus Energy idea, right? This is where you got to see this kind of Hydreigon shine. And it was pretty funny when you got to just crit everything, even after you were -2 from clicking the Draco Meteors. So, you know, be aware of this 6 as well. But again, I just showed you like some of the more common 6s that you could play with Maushold Annihilape. I just gave you 3 teams right there. So yeah, utilize this 6, okay? Because it's very, very threatening. Oh man, the return of Dondozo and Tatsugiri, the commander stuff. Listen, I don't want to hear any complaints. You guys complained about Calorexes for months, okay? I offer you an alternative. Deal with Dondozo and Tatsugiri. All right, so what makes these an impressive pair, obviously, is because of the Omni Boost that you're going to be getting with, you know, Commander. But there's ways to deal with it, right? I even like years ago, I put like a video on how to deal with Dondozo. There's ways to do this, okay? And one of those ways was use Clear Smog Amoonguss. You got to use Haze from Primarina. You got to use Haze on Dragonite. Okay, and that was your way to remove all of these buffs from Dondozo. But early on, this is going to be the typical 6 that you're going to run into, right? So some Tailwind user, usually this is either going to come from a Talonflame or maybe even a Murkrow. You got Gholdengo coming in as a potential lead or a late game cleaner to click Make It Rain. Okay, and then if you want, you could feature the poison stuff with Glimmora, right? Remember Wheezing with the toxic spikes and the poison gas going for chip damage and then letting Calorexes clean up in the late game. In this case, that's the Glimmora role here. You're going for like, you know, these mortal spin stuff. Okay, you can also go for the toxic spikes if you wanted to, set the poison, all right? And the hazards, you know, will slowly chip away at the opponent, and then Dondozo and Tatsugiri can just come in the game and then just finish things off. Now, these last couple of slots, it could be up to you. You don't even have to technically use Glimmora here, but one of those options is Palmot. Obviously, you know, for Palmot with Revival Blessing, you can bring back the dead Dondozo and then get a second cycle out of it. Otherwise, if you don't want to play Palmot, we've even seen Dragonite in this case, where Dragonite can come in and be like this Choice Band nuker rather than the Scale Shot Tailwind set Haze user, right? The Dragonite was just something to KO something immediately. Otherwise, if you didn't want to play Glimmora, right? Or actually, yeah, if you didn't want to play Glimmora, you could just do this. Then you could put Palmot in its place and play the Dondozo Tatsugiri core this way, right? But then we got some variations later on, and you know, we started to vary up the hyper offense with Dondozo a little bit. And I think back to Nielsen's team, who loves Sneasler, who loves Blood Moon Ursaluna, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you here, right? So if you don't remember Nielsen, right now in Regulation I, he's been using this Miraidon core that features Sneasler and Blood Moon Ursaluna. And here we go again, Blood Moon Ursaluna, which is a very strong, even stronger in this format than it is right now in Regulation I. So do with that with what you will. Sneasler here, and then of course this last slot here was the male Indeedee here, you know, providing Psychic Terrain, a Trick Room user, Imprisoned Trick Room, and this is another way to play Dondozo Tatsugiri, you know, the Nielsen way, as I like to call it, right? So those are 2 very easy cores that you could use to start out with. Otherwise, you could still keep something like this, but you change up the partners. You can still do something like this. You could do like Murkrow, Gholdengo. Where are you, Murkrow? And let me just put Gholdengo here. Okay, and then you had an old reliable pair with Garchomp. Right, Garchomp here, yeah, like Tailwind user, Murkrow, Gholdengo. I'm sorry, Tailwind user, Gholdengo, Garchomp. So this is either like a Talonflame here, and in this last slot, it could be whatever you want. Sometimes it was this Sneasler, otherwise it was another Pokemon that you could use here. But Murkrow had insane value on, you know, most teams just because you did get access to Haze, which again was really useful at removing the Dondozo buff. So if you wanted to play it that way, you can definitely play it that way. You also saw some like other hyper aggressive cores. So like Murkrow still came, but then you had the Sneasler hyper offense Psyspam idea where you had Indeedee male. Okay, then you had Sneasler back yet again, and then you had something like Delphox here. You know, just clicking Life Orb Heat Wave stuff, and this was another Dondozo Tatsugiri core. All right, I won't list all of them here, but at the very least, I gave you a couple of good starting points. And again, just letting you know that Dondozo Tatsugiri is back. Trick Room Balance is the next archetype that I wanted to preview. So you don't have any restricteds in this format, right? But Ursaluna can kind of function as that restricted here. And the entire premise of this squad is just built around supporting and enabling the Ursaluna. So you got Incineroar and Amoonguss for your defensive backbone, which is a very common defensive backbone for a lot of Trick Room teams in general. And then your Trick Room setter is Porygon 2. Yo, Porygon 2 gets to come out and play in this format. You haven't even seen this thing in a restricted format. You know, thank you, Urshifu, right? But now P2 gets to come out and play. And, you know, these Porygon sets was always like kind of funny because, again, they used to have something like this, like Terra Fighting, which was pretty cool against stuff like, you know, Archaludon. But obviously you had the Recover and the Trick Room moves. So this way, the Porygon just extended its lifespan. And then you had, like I said, Terra Blast, Terra Fighting. And then you also had Ice Beam for the Dragon types that were running around. Stuff like Dragonite, Garchomp, Salamence. And that's really what you wanted out of your P2, right? And then Gholdengo was like the special attacker on the team besides the Porygon. And then again, it was a Nasty Plot Gholdengo, which you can have because you have the Fake Out and the redirection support coming from the Amoonguss and the Incineroar. Now, this last slot here was always up for grabs, and there was a lot of different things that people tried here, but the most common one was Flamigo. Yo, Flamigo was insane on this kind of team, right? Scrappy was, look at what Scrappy's supposed to do. Fighting normal moves hit ghost types, okay? So that means if you wanted to click a fighting move and you wanted to Terra Ghost so that way it could whiff, that was a no-no because Flamigo has Scrappy, okay? And you're immune to Intimidate. That is busted in this format, okay? Flamigo was crazy against something like an Incineroar, right? And you wanted to bring Incineroar against stuff like Ursaluna and Gholdengo because you had the super effective Dark move into Gholdengo and you got to Intimidate cycle the Ursaluna. But Flamigo says, if you bring that thing, okay, I'm just going to KO it right back. So Flamigo was a very, very useful partner on the 6. And this is, again, one of the most common 6s that you'll find in the restarted Regulation H. Other things that people have tried was Tyranitar. Again, with Tyranitar, you got to give yourself weather control. By the way, I just want to say, all weather was viable in Regulation H. Alolan Ninetales teams was a thing because you got weather and screens. Okay, Tyranitar was also pretty valuable with Excadrill and Corviknight, and we'll get into that team, you know, maybe a little bit later. But T-Tar was a thing in this format because there's no Urshifu, right? If there's no Urshifu, Tyranitar can come out to play. Okay, because look at these base stats. Base 100 HP, base 110 defense, 100 speed depth, 134 attack. You had 4 of the best stat spreads that you would want on a pseudo-legendary, okay? But it gets ruined because something like Urshifu exists. Okay, that is a sham. All right, I just want to say that and give my 2 cents there. Another one that you could do was Hydreigon because, again, with Levitate, you had good synergy with Ursaluna. You got to click Earthquake next to this thing, and it wouldn't hit it, obviously, because you had Levitate, which is, again, relatively useful. So if you wanted to play something like that, that was also a thing. Otherwise, you also had Vivian onto this. Vivian was another annoying Pokemon because, again, you got Tailwind on this team. Okay, so you had a fast mode for something like this, which, again, Gholdengo loves. You had Rage Powder, which was, again, a very useful move to have. But really, you didn't really use Rage Powder. You used Sleep Powder, right? So this way, you could put things to sleep and then just KO them right back, you know, with your partner slot. And then you had Hurricane, you know, your one target move there, and then you just had Protect here. And then with Compound Eyes, of course, your accuracy gets boosted here, right? So that was the other thing that you could do with something like this. Vivian was another player on this. You could also technically feature Dragonite. I've seen Dragonite on some of these. Again, same things, flying type that had pretty decent synergy with Ursaluna. You can go with something like that. There was another one. Even Kilowattrel was a nice little 6 slot there. Again, with competitive, taking advantage of Incineroar that wants to be brought against Ursaluna and Gholdengo. You get a nice little damage boost there. You also get Tailwind again. Thunderbolt here, and then something like Air Slash, and then just Protector. That's Air Cutter, but you know what I mean. So that's another thing that you could have also considered. There was a couple others. Like you could even, I even saw this one for a bit. Primarina just to round out your Fire, Water, Grass core, right? And if you didn't run Clear Smog here, you ran Haze on your Primarina. That was also something that you could do. I've also seen just straight up Sneasler onto stuff like this. Like Sneasler was just an easy Pokemon that you could slap onto. You got another fake out user. You could even just go for coaching place if you really wanted to, but this is another thing that you could do. But anyway, the core of the team was always this 5, okay? That 6 slot just depended on you and how you wanted to play the squad, but this is basically give me support for Ursaluna and Gholdengo, and this Trick Room core with Instant Amoonguss and P2 was the way to do it. All right, here we go. Sneasler Balance. This was maybe the most meta-defining archetype of Regulation H, okay? Because Sneasler was everywhere, and the Balance archetype was very, very imposing, okay? And for good reason. First of all, I want to start with these 3 because I feel like these 3 was always the center focus on a lot of Sneasler Balance teams. After this, you'll either feature some redirector, usually like Magmar or Electabuzz, and then some dragon type, either something like Salamence, Dragapult, or Dragonite, okay? And that was your Sneasler Balance kind of idea. So, couple of ideas. First of all, Sneasler, you know, Dire Claw was busted, okay? Because again, with Dire Claw, you had the 50% chance to sleep, poison, or paralyze the target. 3-turn sleep was annoying. Paralysis was annoying. Poison, not so much, but the chip damage did matter in some cases, right? And then, you know, with your speed tier 120, and then if you had to activate Unburden with the Focus Sash, Sneasler was the fastest thing in the format here. Then you had access to Fake Out, right? Just like Rillaboom here. Then you had the super effective close combat into something like an Archaludon. And then you either had Protect, right? Or you forgoed the Protect and went with something like Coaching, or you forgoed the Fake Out and still kept Coaching, right? So either way, depending on your Sneasler set, it was really, really good. But Coaching was a big thing to do in Regulation H. So where did you go from here? King Gambit was really useful. Why? Because again, 2 reasons. One, you're a dark type, and that was used to kind of counter the Psyspam teams because again, Sneasler fighting poison. You're very weak to psychic type attack. You're very weak to expanding force. So King Gambit was your workaround for that. And Sneasler and even Rillaboom were weak to intimidate from something like an Incineroar. And King Gambit says no to that. So this way you get a free Defiant boost. So that was also a pretty interesting interaction that you could use, you know, with these 3. And this was your core for Sneasler Balance. Then we add your Dragon type. So let's say usually it was either Dragonite, Dragapult, and then came back Scalper, right? So that was also a thing. But Dragapult got to play in this format, right? Remember, Calyrex Shadow Rider is the fastest thing right now, but in this format there is no Shadow Rider. So that means Dragapult becomes the top of the speed tier in terms of what you want to do in terms of your EV spreads, right? So if I were to make this Jolly, for example, okay, Jolly 213, 214 was the benchmark. So that meant under Tailwind, you went for 107, right? Because 107 under Tailwind becomes 214, and 214 got to outsped a Dragapult, okay? So just keep that in mind in terms of speed tier. We'll release a speed tier video for Regulation H shortly, all right? But I just wanted to make that note. And then after this, what did you want for your redirector? If you went the Electabuzz route, okay, that meant your fire type, obviously not a Magmar, but you could do something like the endgame win con of Volcarona, all right? This is another thing that you could do. Otherwise, if you went with something like Magmar, okay, pros and cons to both Magmar and Electabuzz. I'll get into that maybe in another video or later on. I think we talked about it before back in our Regulation H content. But if you went with Magmar instead, then you got to pick other things, okay, that you could sneak on here. So you got to even pick like Primarina, for example. And this became a Haze user, right? I'm just showing you like an example if you wanted to do something like this, right? So this was another form of Sneasler Balance, right? Otherwise, you could even do the back Scalper stuff, but that featured the solo Dozo, as we like to call it, right? So you still have Kingambit, you still have Rillaboom. I'll throw in back Scalper here, right? So now you can even call this Back's Balance, okay? And this was your Scale Shot user as opposed to Dragonite here, right? So Scale Shot, Icicle Spear, right? This had the loaded dice that would be in place of the Dragonite. And then this was always something like Ice Shard, and then you had Protect, right? Protect, and then Ice Shard. Okay, yeah, we'll just put that over there. So this was your the rest of your core. And then after that, you had the solo Dondozo with the Volcarona, right? Okay, now this Dondozo was going for stuff like Yawn and Fissure. okay, which was relatively annoying because Yawn forced you to make a choice. Either you stay in and go to sleep, or you switch out and you're out of position, and then you could capitalize off of that. And then these King Gambit sets, because you had double fake out and you had the redirection from the Volcarona, you could even go for the setup Swords Dance play, okay? And then that was very dangerous because now all of a sudden King Gambit can become a sweeper. This thing gets a really, really strong Sucker Punch. Then you got Kowtow Cleave, okay? And then obviously you have Protector. Usually this was something like either Black Glasses or Safety Goggles, okay? But this was another form of Sneasler Balance. Again, sticking to the formula, give me that one Dragon type that's really good. And then from there, I can round out my Fire, Water, Grass core depending on what I want and what I need to cover for. So another thing, what was another one? Oh yeah, the Dragonite stuff, right? So if you wanted to use Dragonite, okay, that was totally fine, right? This was the multi-scale Dragonite that got Scale Shot, okay? Eventually later on it changed, but you got to have Haze here. And then if you wanted, you did have Tailwind and then Protect. Otherwise, another set, if you didn't want to go for this, you had Low Kick, Scale Shot, Low Kick, and then you had also Extreme Speed. And then this obviously was the loaded dice because you ran Scale Shot here. So if you wanted to run Dragonite like that, that was also an option. Otherwise, Scale Shot, the Haze, right, and the Extreme Speed was the standard way to do this, right? And this was something like Terra Fire, Terra Steel. Goodbye back Scalper. And then after this, if I did Electabuzz, then I still had a Volcarona here, right? And so on and so forth, okay? But anyway, this was the idea. You had coaching plays with Sneasler. You had Dragonite going for Scale Shots, which was annoying because, again, you got to break Sash, you got to outspeed things after that, and then just go for these extreme speeds that were very hard-hitting because you got the coaching boost from something like the Sneasler. You had King Gambit, Endgame Potential, and then Electabuzz and Volcarona just came in and supported the whole entire squad with what they wanted to do. Volcarona also was another win con with Quiver Dance. So you could have Electabuzz here, redirect things, and then Volcarona go for Quiver Dance. You could do it that way. Otherwise, King Gambit went for Swords Dance. But the buzz was interesting because, again, 105 speed meant you were a fast redirector, okay? And you normally don't get this. And Vital Spirit was important because you needed this against Sneasler, okay? You can't get parried, right, because you're an electric type. And then Vital Spirit means you can't fall asleep, so you could redirect the Sneasler, Dire Claw stuff, okay? And then the poison, whatever. You didn't really care about that a whole lot. And then Electabuzz, you got stuff like Taunt. You had Electro Web to give yourself speed control if you wanted to go for that. And then, you had Protect, or you could just went for like Thunderbolt here if you really wanted to. But that was the idea behind the Vital Spirit mons, okay? You got to really take advantage and have some resistance, as a counterplay to Sneasler there, all right? So I gave you a couple ideas there. There were more, obviously, but again, I just showed you some of the more common stuff. Be ready to handle Sneasler Balance. Next up is this trio, also known as Doug. Why is it called Doug? Because of the first letters of their names. Dragonite, with the D, Ursaluna with the U, and then Gholdengo with the G. Why is this a thing? That's because of the synergy that they have defensively with each other, right? In terms of being able to pivot in for resistances. So again, imagine Dragonite being weak to Dragon and Ice type attacks. Gholdengo could come in and resist that. Imagine Gholdengo being weak to Fire and Ground. Dragonite is perfect for that because the Ground type gets whiffed. You're a Flying type and you get to resist Fire. And then Ursaluna, same thing. You're weak to Water. You're weak to Grass. And again, both of those things are resisted by something like a Dragonite, and so on and so forth, right? So 2 special attackers, 1 physical attacker. So these 3 have great synergy with each other. So now in terms of how do you support it, you need a defensive backbone, right? Because these are 3 very offensive mons, but they need support. So something like an Incineroar and a Mungus was a thing. And then you just slapped on a Sneasler here and you called it, right? Because this was I think this was the winning team from Stuttgart. Yes, I think it was Stuttgart. I'm trying to remember. I believe it was, right? Because again, you have double fake out pressure coming from the Sneasler and the Incineroar, right? And then you have the Amoonguss to give you that trigger matchup along with the Ursaluna. And the Dragonite was the set that we talked about: Scale Shot, Haze, and Tailwind. And then you had Protect here. You didn't need Extreme Speed, right? You just needed to give your team speed control. So you had everything here. You had speed control, okay? You had Intimidate, Fake Out Pressure, Okay, you had everything, right? You got the physical damage, you got the special damage from these guys. So this was one of the other very useful ideas, you know, behind Doug. Okay, it's not the only way to play it. The other way that you can play it is with the screen support. Let me take away some options here. Okay, the other way that you can do this was with the Alolan Ninetales screens. So this way you can rely on the bulk if you needed to set up the Gholdengo and or the Blood Moon Ursaluna. Sometimes these were Calm Mind Ursalunas. It really just depended on some of the mons there. But, you know, these Dragonites, they were prone to Intimidate too. And that's where something like Annihilape came into play. And then from here, you had something like a Magmar or an Electabuzz here. And this was another very, very strong type of way to play Doug. So you have the screen support, you had the redirection again, and then, you know, these strong attackers could just come from the support and then just deal with your opponent that way, right? So that was another way that you could play if you really wanted to. Otherwise, if you didn't want to run Tailwind on your Dragonite, you needed to commit the Tailwind slot to something like a Talonflame for that matter. But this was like one of Dragonite's best set on something like this, okay? There are other Doug variations. I've even seen, like, instead of Ninetales, you could even do Grimmsnarl screens. That was another thing. And then you could even do, like, Volcarona, I remember. So let me take off Magmar. All right, so this was another thing. Again, Volcarona being that endgame win con as well. And then that last slot, you know, was something else. It could have been, like, Rillaboom for that matter. But this was another way that you could play Doug, right? Just supporting these three, right? Like more Rage Powder and screen support. So you could play like that. What else was around that time? I showed you Ninetales screens. Yeah, but anyway, this was the way to play if you really needed it. Again, it kind of goes back to some of the Sneasler Balance stuff. You're just trying to make sure you enable your attackers and give them enough support. But Doug was a thing, and I do expect it to come back yet again. Maybe we'll get more variations, but be ready for the instant Amoonguss Sneasler one. Double Dragons was even playable in Regulation H. I like to call it Double Dragon Balance because it does feature the Fantasy Core, which we'll talk about in a second, but Dragonite and Garchomp were the most common Double Dragons to be used. There are other Double Dragons that you can play together, and we'll also touch upon those two after we look at this. But Dragonite and Garchomp have always had some pretty decent synergy because, again, with Garchomp being able to click Earthquake, that synergized relatively decently with something like Dragonite, and sometimes to an extent Salamence, because again, you are flying type and you're not going to get hit by your own dragon type move. Now, Kingambit was, again, a very much needed support for these two for two reasons. One, Dragonite wasn't inner focus on these type of teams. It was usually something like multi-scale. Some of them may have been inner focus, but the point is, both of these are very susceptible to ice type attacks. You've got 2 4x weaknesses to them, right? So you got to have a steel type resist on here. So Kingambit was that, and then at the same time, anti-intimidate support against something like Incineroar. So Gambit was very useful on these teams. And then after that, good old reliable defensive backbone, Incineroar and Amoonguss rounded this team out. And then you needed some special attacking presence on your team, right? And that's where the Alolan Ninetales came into play. Now, some of these Ninetales, most commonly, they were either this Choice Specs variants, so like these hard-hitting Blizzards, these hard-hitting Freeze Dries and whatnot. Sometimes they even carried the Misty Terrain tech, just so that, you know, it helps you get around the Sneasler stuff, and it reduces Dragon-type damage into your own Dragons for that matter. So Ninetales was very much appreciated, and then against the Mirror, you got to pressure them back with your Ice-type attacks also. Otherwise, you could also run screens, but I didn't think it was needed. Then it would be a little bit too passive. But Instant Amoonguss was your support here. Ninetales could also support with something like this. If it ran a Sachet, then it had Encore as well. But this was one of the main ways that you could play Garchomp and Dragonite here with the Instant Amoonguss Kingambit core there. And it was relatively common for quite a few regionals for a good reason, right? Because again, Kingambit and Instant gave you something for the Psyspam matchup. Dragonite was useful against another Dragonite, also against other dragons. Garchomp was pretty good into Archaludon. You had the Ninetales for the Pelipper terrain stuff. I'm sorry, the weather control. So you had a lot going for you when you had something like this. There were some other ideas that you could do with Gholdengo onto these teams, and that way you could get a little bit more special attack damage. But I just felt like, you know, Kingambit was so good at deterring Intimidate spam that it was very much appreciated. So were there other ideas? Yeah, there were. But at the very least, this was the most common one for Dragonite Garchomp. The Salamence Rain idea with Archaludon was the other kind of double dragon core that you could use besides D9 and Chomp. And the rest of the team is actually relatively solid. So you know what you're getting with these two, right? You got that flying pivot away from the ground type weakness from Archaludon. Fighting type gets resisted again because Salamence is a flying type. So you have that going for you. And then at the same time, you can re-switch out your Salamence in case of an ice type attack into Arc or another steel type that you would have on your team. So after this, you still ran stuff like Pelipper, okay? And then you also had Amoonguss and Vasculegion on these teams, right? Just, you know, I'm taking the Rain Core that they had. Okay, and this is in essence what you had. And then after this, if you wanted, you had either Gholdengo as the steel type, or you had Kingambit as your steel type there. So it depended how you wanted to play this, but look, you've got access to Tailwind on Salamence, and you also had access to Tailwind on your Pelipper. So all of these options very much appreciated the Tailwind support, but you could definitely play something like this if you really wanted to. Otherwise, Kingambit can definitely fit onto this slot. I've even seen Maushold to an extent be played on some of these teams ideally, but this is just another common variation that you could do that works, right? We've seen Salamence Rain before from like Justin Tang and Chilean Tang, and I think a team like this can also be played and be utilized and win a potential regional as well, just because of, again, the aggression that you get from a lot of your attackers, the support that you're getting from the Amoonguss and the Pelipper is already pretty good, and then Archaludon is just a beast. Another dragon duo that you could play together is technically Dragapult and Archaludon. These were a little bit more rare than Dragonite and Garchomp, but they still could work decently just because of some of the type synergy that they have. Again, Dragapult being weak to an ice type attack or, you know, a dark type attack. Archaludon can kind of soak that up as well. And again, the fighting weakness just gets whiffed into the ghost typing here, right? So, but a lot of these Dragapult teams, they didn't really feature Pelipper, right? So you couldn't really use the Assault Vest, Electro Shot, Body Press idea. So instead, what they did run was this Power Herb set with Electro Shot. So you needed some way to activate this thing, and Power Herb Electro Shot was that way. And that means no AV for you. That means you still had Draco Meteor, you still had Flash Cannon and whatnot, and then you had Protect here. So you could still play this way, and this was usually like a band set. And then after this, you had like an idea for hyper offense. You had Murkrow, you had Sneasler, then you had, you know, the male Indeedee to help you with the give you a Psyspam presence and, you know, deny Trick Room with Imprison Trick Room. And then this was something like a Delphox, and this was easily like a very another pretty standard. I shouldn't even say standard. This was a pretty successful team that you could play, and it was played in the regionals, but again, not very, very common, not as common as like the Dragonite Garchomp stuff, but it is an idea, right? There were some other variances that you could play with something like this. I have seen stuff like Yanmega and Politoed. I think you could also technically play it like that as well, but this is just easy to start with, right? You know, you got your hyper offense with standard Psyspam, so you can definitely play the duo like this. Art Trick Room was also another relatively common art type that you can play, and again, was one of the things you needed to counter because again, Psyspam was relatively annoying. So Indeedee, Hatterene, Torkoal, Ursaluna was that core. Again, you got Follow Me and Terrain support, so this way you don't get faked out and whatnot. And Hatterene was able to click Expanding Force. You also had Dazzling Gleam on you, right? Hatterene was just a really, really good special attacker, right? And then if they knocked out the Indeedee, then you get to bring in Torkoal, Click Eruption, Melt Things. Ursaluna could do the same and be that physical sweeper on your team as well. Sometimes you also had Hatterene and Armor Rouge, right? Again, Flash Fire was relatively useful. You got to soak things up. You had access to Trick Room as well, okay? But sometimes it just wasn't used. What was more importantly used was Gallade on these teams. Why Gallade? Because if you look at this core, Incineroar just kind of eats this, right? Because you're able to resist Eruption, you Intimidate Cycle the Ursaluna, you have Dark type attacks into Incineroar, and into Indeedee, and then you can't even take Expanding Force damage because you are a Dark type. So Incin is great against the Psyspam core, which is why Gallade comes in with Clear Amulet, right? Now you don't get intimidated, and you just hit the Incin super hard with something like Sacred Sword, or even something like Close Combat if you really wanted to. And then at the same time, You also had a pretty good physical psychic attack in terrain with Psycho Cut, and then you yourself could also set up Trick Room this way. So Galley was very important on these teams. A strong fighting type in general was pretty useful. And if you didn't want Gallade, then Annihilape was your thing. And this was the other thing that you could do with something like this, right? Where you could run the Annihilape with that patented Choice Scarf, Final Gambit stuff, right? You nuke something, you KO it, you click Trick Room, you bring in Torkoal, things melt, right? That's the other thing that you could do with something like this. Otherwise, you also had the Hisuian Lilligant got to come out and play in this format, right? Sleep Powder plays, Chlorophyll, offer a fast mode. Okay, you had the After You Eruption play that you could do with Torkoal that always needed to be respected at times. So you can definitely play this. It's actually just relatively linear in terms of an archetype, but it has had some pretty good results. More results on the online Limitless tournaments than like the in-person stuff, right? Because if you look at the results, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Some of the ones that did have success in person was the teams that featured regular Executor. Again, with Chlorophyll, it gave you another Expanding Force user. This probably replaced the Hatterene slot, if I remember correctly, right? And then after this, yeah, this was the idea. Like you had Expanding Force and you had Sleep Powder, okay? And those were like two of your main moves. You also had access to Trick Room and then some grass move like Energy Ball, for example. And this was usually your focus Ashmon here. So if you want, you can definitely play this kind of archetype. It was always respected because you need something against terrain from Indeedee and you need something to resist Torkoal Ursaluna stuff. Incin was pretty good against these guys. So you really needed that strong fighting type to help you deal with the Incineroar stuff. But if you do, then make sure you position it and you don't let it die so easily. The Jumpluff Sun team was another meta-defining team in Regulation H, and it really revolved around these two with the Jumpluff and the Torkoal here bringing out the Sun. But this Torkoal set in particular was an eject button set, right? Because it was more of a supportive Torkoal at the end of the day. Yes, you had Eruption that you could click in Trick Room if you had that Trick Room setter or if you had the Trick Room matchup, but you also clicked Overheat where you got to be able to nuke something and then not just sit there and be useless with the minus debuff and instead switch yourself out, bring something else in that was relatively more useful, right? And that was one way of conserving your weather, because if they brought in the Pelipper against you, you could click Overheat, switch out, bring Torkoal back in later, bring something else in the meantime, right? But there were two main variations to play this. There was like the Marco Silva way, and then there was the Joseph Ugarte way, right? So Marco, what he says is, I'm going to play Tailwind, I'm going to have Sleep Powder, right? And I also have redirection support with Rage Powder because I also want to set Trick Room on this team if I want to go the Trick Room direction with my Torkoal, right? And then he also featured the Ursaluna to give you that physical presence on a Trick Room team, right? Torkoal, Ursaluna. That's what we said previously. Right, and then after this, I need the fast mode on my team. I need the hard-hitting mode on my team. That's where they involved the Choice Specs Solar Power Charizard here, right? Which also had pretty decent synergy with Ursaluna because, again, you could click Earthquake next to a ground type. And again, Zard, just does a ton of damage in the sun. And this was like maybe the one time where Charizard was able to do a lot in a meta where it wasn't Dynamax, right? And that says a lot. Okay, poor Charizard. And then this last slot here, I can't remember what it was. I think it was an Incineroar. Yeah, I think it was, right? So Incin, of course, just Intimidate, Fake Out, Redirection Support. Try and set up your Trick Room / Tailwind, and then just reposition the board if you have to. But this was one way to really play it, right? It revolved around the Trick Room mode as well as the fast mode, and it was relatively hard to play against because it was very flexible depending on what you wanted to do. You could go that Trick Room mode, you could go that fast mode, you could do multiple leads, you could do instant P2 leads, right? You could do Torkoal in the back, right? Where Charizard P2 as a lead, right? Bring in Torkoal, sweep from there, or switch out the Zard, bring in Torkoal, or bring in Ursaluna, and then click Trick Room if you want to do it like that. So lots of ideas that you could do. Otherwise, if you wanted to go a different direction, right, and go the Joe Ugarte route, where they still had a dominant fire type sweeper, but it wasn't coming from the Charizard, it was coming from the Hisuian Typhlosion. Yes, the Typhlosion one was the Pokemon that was clicking Eruption, and Joe actually didn't even have Eruption on his set. It was more like an Overheat Helping Hand set, right? A more supportive Torkoal set. And then after this, he had Garchomp as his dragon type on this team, and he actually had a double dragon idea, like Garchomp and Dragonite over here. Okay, rounded out by King Gambit just to help him in that Psyspam matchup, as well as the Anti-Intimidate against both his Dragonite and his Garchomp, right? Because I remember his Garchomp was Life Orb, and this was not Inner Focus, it was a multi-scale Dragonite here, and this was his team, right? So double dragons, okay, but again, Tailwind support, pretty cool. He did not have Rage Powder. He ran something else. I think it was also just Encore, a little bit more support. And then King Gambit with AV was just so hard to remove and so annoying. And again, gave you something to play, you know, for that Psyspam matchup, as well as a deterrence for Incineroar. But if you can position the Typhlosion correctly, it could just sweep with that Eruption. Otherwise, you also still had that Torkoal that you could use in the Trick Room matchup. Otherwise, it was always a pretty decent pivot for your Typhlosion just to do boosted eruption damage. So you can play both teams depending on which way you like, but you'll definitely see both variants when Regulation H starts again. So be aware of Jumpluff Sun. Last but certainly not least, we got you covered here with Tailwind Hyper Offense. You HO plebs out there, don't worry, we're gonna help you out. We got a team for you as well. Okay, so all right, Talonflame clicking Tailwind. All right, yeah, Talonflame gets to come out and play, right? Talonflame, Tailwind, you get to click Expanding Force with this Indeedee, right? This is your Imprisoned Trick Room Denial if you really want to go for it. Here it is. And then, of course, you got Blood Moon that can come in under Tailwind. Click Hyper Voice, more spread move damage, might as well. The Sneasler gets to come in with the Psychic Seeds, activate on Burn, click Dire Claw, sleep everything for 27 turns, and then the opponent doesn't get to play the game, and then you just win off of that, right? So you can play it like this. I've also seen Electabuzz on these teams for a little bit more support with Vital Spirit. That's going to be useful against the Sneasler mirrors, obviously. Otherwise, you have some other variations that you could do. I've even seen Dragonite just to round out these teams. If you don't want to run Incineroar, you can definitely run that, but otherwise Dragonite is another thing that you could run here. And you still need a Dragonite because it was your main hail user, right? You had Scale Shot and Haze, and then Protect. That last slot was whatever, because you know you have Tailwind here from Talonflame, so whatever you wanted here was the play. But you still needed something for Dondozo, right? So Dragonite came onto these teams and did just that. Otherwise, you could also just round this out here with Dondozo Tatsugiri if you really wanted to. So here, let me take these away. Here we go, Dondozo and Tatsugiri, right? That was another boring way that you could play these guys. If you really wanted to do it like that, you can. Those were the easy ways to play it, all right? But, you know, these last two slots, it's really up for grabs, but I gave you a couple of ideas already. But the most common one was Dondozo Giri or Electabuzz Dragonite. I've also seen Incineroar in that last slot, like I said before. Otherwise, what else could you technically run there? I'm not really sure at the moment. But those were like the most common ones that I remember right off the bat. I think you could also technically run Archaludon here, right? But it wouldn't be the AV set. It would be the Power Herb set. So you can definitely still do something like that. I could also see Gholdengo coming onto these teams, right? Yeah, I've seen a couple of Gholdengo variants. I don't remember what this last slot here, but you definitely want something with Haze. I think it was that, oh shoot, that Fighting Grass type. What was that thing called? Oh, it escapes me. The Owl. Oh my goodness. Yeah, the Owl fighting type that also got access and didn't really care. I can't remember. Not Breloom. It was another one. I'll find it later. I can't believe I forgot the name. But it was like one of the starters too. Was it Decidueye? Oh yeah, it was. Yeah, it was Decidueye, right? Because again, Scrappy was annoying. Okay, so you got to use this, and this was another variation, right? But anyway, so if you wanted to play hyper offense and just click Tailwind and click buttons, this was the 4, okay? And then that last 4, the last 2 usually was that Dragonite and some redirector like an Electabuzz, but that was pretty much it. Relatively linear, just like the Heart Trick Room teams. All right, so that's pretty much it. Those were 10 archetypes that were very, very strong and popular in Regulation H the first time around. So hopefully we gave you a little bit of a refresher, a crash course in case you forgot what else was played besides Sneasler. Okay, so now you've got options here. So if there's something that you're interested in and you want to fully flesh it out, you know, with more EVs and round out your supporting cast and you need some help, make sure you sign up for coaching on the channel. A tier 3 sub gets you a one-on-one Discord session with me where we get to build these squads from scratch. We hash out the EVs, we test it out on ladder, and maybe potentially send you to some tournaments to test out as well. But if team building help is what you need, tier 3 gets you that help with me. All right. If you look in the comment section, you'll also see the same link to join the channel with that tier 3 sub. So feel free to click that as well. Otherwise, you can join the Discord. That's always free. And feel free to engage and bounce ideas off of our community. Like I said before, we are at 1,200 members now. So again, very large VGC community that we have going. So feel free to, come in and join us, right? But anyway, hopefully this helps you. We'll be putting out more Regulation H content along with our J and our I content, throughout this month. If there's something you're really interested in, feel free to comment below and asking for that. Otherwise, we're still gonna continue on. I think we'll get some rental teams going for I, just as our little last goodbye for Regulation I, and then we'll go back to Regulation J team building, and of course do some feature showcases for Reg H. All right, but that's it for now, folks. We'll be back with another video in the next one. Peace out and have a good one.